Thank you for those remarks to help us put this man in perspective. Linda, Drew, Bill, Catherine, Webster family, FBI friends, CIA, I know you're here. My name is Bill Baker. I'm a retired special agent of the FBI. I'm so proud to be able to represent my peers, the thousands of FBI employees who had the good fortune of working under Bill Webster's tenure as leader of the FBI. He was an amazing man, and my first encounter with him is noted on your handouts, your printed handouts. It's one of the quotes. I was in the courtyard of the Hoover Building when Webster was sworn in by the President, the Vice President, members of Congress, the media, his friends, the public, the FBI. And his remarks, as stated there, are even stronger when I remember them, because he said, "I and the FBI will do the work the American people expect of us in the way the Constitution demands of us." Not a bad start for a director just taking over. But he had those, like anyone taking over an organization. He had doubters. Anyone who comes in will have doubters. It's the strong man, the man with bearing, the man who can lead, who survives that. And Webster was able to do that in a way that reminded me years later of Dorothy Kearns Goodwin in her terrific biography of Abraham Lincoln, when she put forth that this man was, her book talked about how Bill Webster, in his time frame, took over and managed his position so well as Abe Lincoln did in Team of Rivals. It reminded me later of that, but it helped me understand the man I was beginning to know and I would work so closely with for over the 10 next years. But he was able to bring those together, and then shortly after he took over, he was confronted with what anyone does when they run a big corporation or a big bureau. He was confronted with a bureaucratic faux pas. We had written requirements that in order to be a special agent of the FBI, you had to have correctable vision in both eyes. Tommy Norris was a Navy SEAL, seriously wounded in combat in Vietnam. He was rescued by a Navy SEAL who went in and got him because his teammates had left Tommy for dead. Tommy came out barely alive, but he lost an eye. He wanted to be an FBI agent. He applied. Some clerk way down the line said, "Oh, it doesn't make sense. He can't be." Tommy Norris didn't give up. He reapplied. I and others around me brought this to Webster's attention, and I think his Navy days kicked in, because he said to us, if Mr. Norris can survive the rigorous tests that we give to every new agent at Quantico in our new agent training, if he can do this in the classroom, if he can do this on our gym mats, and if he can do this at our firing range, then let us welcome him to be an FBI agent. Well, Tommy, as you might imagine, passed that all in flying colors. And several years later, he applied for the elite hostage rescue team. A little irony here. That team was created by Bill Webster. And he served on that team and had a glorious career with the FBI. I was out in the West Coast serving in offices the way we climb in the Bureau, but I was brought back by Bill Webster, and I took over congressional and public affairs. It was a job that meant I would have to work very closely with him through the years that I would be there. And in 1986, he was awarded the University of Virginia's highest honor, the Thomas Jefferson Award in Law. Knowing that I had attended and graduated from the University of Virginia, he invited me to go with him to Charlottesville for the actual ceremonies. And you can imagine how I felt when I was greeted on the steps of Monticello, the wonderful home of Thomas Jefferson. And there was my English professor from college, who then had become the president of the University of Virginia, Edgar Shannon. I was just overwhelmed by all this, and then was ushered through this beautiful house of Thomas Jefferson's, and then into the dining room, where we sat with the Virginia hierarchy in black tie and celebrated with minor libation, eating off of Thomas Jefferson's dinner plates. What could possibly go wrong with a night like that in April 1986? Everything. The next morning, Webster and I were notified that the Miami office was involved in a terrible shootout with two heavily armed bank robbers. The results, I'm wearing the badge now like many around you are. Ben Grogan and Jerry Dove were killed, two of our agents. 5 more were seriously injured. One of the worst shootouts in history in modern times for the FBI. And the FBI is family. We came together. Webster immediately made the right decision. He notified Virginia, I can't stay here for the presentation. We flew to Miami, and I watched him up close and personal deal with the grieving FBI employees and the victims and their families. And he did an incredible job, and I became very much on his side. And I watched this go on with my period with him working, going around the country, literally around the world, visiting all our offices, talking with our personnel, bringing together any of those who had doubts, and letting them know that he was a firm leader and there to be trusted. In 1987, President Reagan was confronted with a real dilemma. Bill Casey was director of Central Intelligence, and CIA was very much involved in that time in dealing with the Iran-Contra inquiry, focused on them and others in government. But Bill Casey passed away, and Webster was called upon by Reagan to replace him. Not surprising to me, but surprising to some, even at the agency, like the doubters that first encountered him at the FBI. But Webster knew, as you mentioned, sir, he knew that he had to deal with that. And he used to say to me and smile, you know, I'm a private citizen on loan to the government. And his private citizen days were way outnumbered by his government service days. Reagan picked him. I handled his confirmation hearing with my very able staff before the Senate Intelligence Committee and then before the full Senate. 95-1 with some in absentia. The only senator to vote against him was one senator. And for any of you who want to know who that is, see me at the reception. On the way up for President Reagan to formally announce his appointment now for Judge Webster to make this transition from one of our 2 most important agencies to the other of our 2 most important government agencies. Some may argue there are others. I'll stand with my statement. But Webster in the car on the way up to the White House got into a serious mode. And he looked at me and he said, Bill, I want you to go over to the CIA with me. And I said, Judge, I'm a career FBI agent. I'd have to really think about this. And then he gave me that legendary steely-eyed stare. And he said, you do that. You go home and talk to your wife, Robin, tonight. And you think it over and come back tomorrow morning and tell me yes. I didn't have an option. I went over to the CIA in 1987, and the judge was very fortunate because there was a gentleman there who you will hear from later this afternoon. But Bob Gates was a deputy, and he knew the Soviet Union and Russia probably better than anyone. He also knew the organization, and Bob stayed on and became the closest advisor to Judge Webster. They developed a relationship that was necessary between the deputy and the director. And that relationship was something he really, really aided. And thank you, Bob Gates, for that, because I witnessed that personally. I also know how sharp you were because he took me out on a range once. We were on a trip together, and I knew he was questioning me about Bill Webster, but he did it in a way that only the best of the CIA could do. So I had a few glasses of wine with him and let him know that, no, there's no doubt about the man, none at all. And I spent 2 years there that I likened to getting a PhD without the sheepskin. I met some of the best and brightest in U.S. government. But after 2 years there at the CIA, I received a call from deputy at the FBI, Floyd Clark, and he said to me, "Bill, we want you to come back." And I said, "Well, I can't do that without Director Webster's approval here." And he laughed and he said, "Director Sessions is on the phone with him now. You have that approval." And I went in to see the judge and he smiled. He said, "Bill, if it weren't for the fact that I have too many problems having headed these two agencies, I would have liked the Supreme Court. For you, going back to the FBI to head worldwide criminal investigations is like me wanting the Supreme Court, but you can do it." So I did. I went back. It was 1989. The world was in turmoil. And again, Bob Gates' experience, and he can go into more detail, but Soviet Union, Russia, we were dealing with the collapse of that. We were also dealing, if you remember, while I was back heading the criminal division and he was there at CIA, with the first Gulf War. We were also dealing with terrorism on a stance that we hadn't before. So there was a lot going on, and yet we had the able leadership and we faced it and we got through that. During that time, again, as you have noted, he wasn't so busy that he didn't get a chance to meet, fall in love with, and marry Linda. And that was a great step while he was handling all these other small items. Then, in 1991, Judge Webster retired from government service. And remember that comment I made. He smiled, and he was now going back to the private sector, to law, his other forte. I stayed on at the FBI until the end of 1991, and then I retired also. The man who had been my boss and my mentor for those many years now became my personal friend. And anyone in government knows that when you have a boss in an agency, you can be close, but you really can't get personal till you're in that retired level and share the real truth to stories. During that time frame, the judge was fantastic, Linda. We would go to their homes. They would come out to California, and we visited. You pulled off a great stunt, Linda, worthy of a CIA operative. Sandra Day O'Connor was coming out to speak at Pepperdine Law School, and she was going to talk to the Pepperdine students and the public. And Judge Webster was led to believe that he was going out there to introduce Sandra Day O'Connor, which in fact he did. It was perfect. The next night, he thought he was going to a dinner with Sandra Day and the rest of us, including Linda, and he thought that that was also for him. What he didn't know was, the surprise was, you had planned the whole plot. Sandra O'Connor was in on it, but it was an evening to announce his special award at Pepperdine University School of Law. So thank you for that. I'd like to close now in remembering some of the values that really make any one of us either great or not so great. But Webster had so many tributes, so many issues that he faced, he handled with wisdom, and as he did in Miami after that shootout, with consoling the families. He could face real serious trauma and show his leadership. And it drew my attention to a book by Washington's own Bill Bennett. It was called The Book of Virtues. And in that book, Bennett points out courage, leadership, empathy, family, religion, and friends. And now, if I could close, really close, I'd like to mention the close relationship by two English poets and writers that were named in Bennett's book, and that would have been James Boswell and Samuel Johnson. It's an anthology, and this is it. New friends and old friends. Make new friends, but keep the old. Those are silver, these are gold. Friendships that have stood the test, time and change are surely best. Brow may wrinkle, hair grow gray, friendship never knows decay. But old friends, alas, may die. New friends must their place supply. Cherish friendship in your breast. New is good, but old is best. Make new friends, but keep the old. Those are silver, these are gold. William Hedgecock Webster, you are pure gold. Rest in peace.